Good morning, folks. Instructor Gaynor here. We're moving along to Chapter 15 of the Fundamentals of Ethics. Note that there is no collateral reading in the companion textbook, The Ethical Life, for this chapter. However, in my D2L module, I do have a classic essay by the philosopher James Rachels, in case you're interested in checking it out. It's over 25 years old, but it is James Rachels arguing about the alleged distinction using what's called the doctrine of doing and allowing. The distinction between killing and letting die. And he will deal with a controversial position that was taken by the American Medical Association that allowed physicians to give parents whose child was born with Down syndrome as well as intestinal blockage. The parents were given the choice: would you like us to remove the blockage, or should we let nature take its course? Now, the idea was, if you didn't remove the blockage, the Down syndrome child would die. But the thing is, on this technicality, you weren't technically killing the child. You were merely letting nature take its course, merely letting the child die. That was the position of the American Medical Association in the late 1970s when he wrote that essay opposing that point of view. Because he considered their distinction, passive euthanasia, to be really morally no better than actually killing the child. He says, if you've already made the decision that it is moral that the child be better off dead, then it would be more humane to actually give the child a lethal injection at that point, rather than to let the child die over a period of 3 or more days of dehydration. Now that I hope to stoke your interest a little bit. Yeah, the point I was trying to make in getting started is that some of the distinctions made in this chapter, in my opinion and others, are really sometimes not even meaningful distinctions at all. But they might actually cover up what I would call some, and James Rachels would agree, egregious injustices, egregious indecencies. Now, those not so nice things said, the main points of the topic will be to discuss ethical pluralism, an introduction to ethical pluralism, and the issue of absolute moral rules, as well as some ways that Kantian ethical theories have sometimes been modified as such to try to deal with what the author of our text calls disaster or catastrophe prevention. Anyway, the author of the text begins by talking about the structure of moral theories. We've actually discussed this before, but not in so many plain words. All of the normative ethical theories that we have discussed so far have been cases of what are called ethical monism. Mon. This is from the Greek for one. Monistic theories argue that morality can be explained by one principle. And as the author of the text puts it, ethical monisms will contend that there is a single supreme principle. And that the features of the singular supreme principle are as follows. It's in my notes, but I'm writing it again on the board for emphasis. First and foremost, the supreme principle will be absolute. And I hope you know this by now. If a principle or a rule is absolute, it means it ought to be broken when? Correct. Yeah. Under absolutely no circumstances. That's what it means to contend that a principle is absolute. It also contends that said singular principle is fundamental. To say that it's fundamental is to say that it cannot be broken down into a more simple or basic principle. Now let me give you a couple of examples. The author does this too. And this should actually be by way of review at this point. According to utilitarianism, which is indeed an ethical monism, there is one fundamental rule, and that is the principle of utility. Always act to maximize utility. Always act in such ways that you will maximize overall well-being, overall happiness. Then you will have done the right thing. Now keep in mind, act utilitarians will claim that you don't need any other rules than that. As long as you're focused on how to fulfill that rule and then going out and trying your best to do it, and if you can succeed, you will have done what morality demands. Now, Kantianism, remember, act such in a way that the principle of your conduct will be universalizable. Act such that the maxim of your conduct could be willed to be a universal law of nature. That's the categorical imperative. That is Kant's fundamental moral rule. It can't be reduced into anything more basic. Other rules, hypothetical imperatives, are derivable from that fundamental rule. The theories that we've seen so far have been versions of ethical monism. They have made absolute moral claims, and they have claimed that there is a fundamental moral rule that ought to guide us. Now, what are the attractions of monistic theories? Any ideas? I'll give you one of them that the author doesn't talk about. Concision and simplicity. We like the idea of reducing complexity. And if we can find a system in which we can find one fundamental principle, that would on the surface seem to make our moral lives easier. Yeah, all you got to do to be moral is figure out what the one rule is, and then you go about trying to follow it. It's simple, it's concise, it's fairly easy to consider, even if it's not easy to carry out. Philosophers have actually believed the same thing. They have sought a fundamental moral rule or principle. Now, some of the concerns associated with monistic theories that we will hear from critics is that, and some of you may have noticed this yourself, that there seem to be other things that matter, or at least ought to matter, that don't seem to be addressed by our fundamental rule theories. I'll give you the easy example. Remember when the author said with the principle of utility, that it would lead in some instances to the commission of egregious injustices. Why is that? In order to maximize overall well-being, you might actually have to harm some people. And some of us would say that's not really fair, that some people ought to suffer for the quote-unquote greater good. So critics of Kantianism, or rather utilitarianism, would say, but what about fairness? Also, is happiness really all that matters? Because remember, it talks about maximizing overall well-being, and that happiness of the whole is the end goal. Well, is that really all that matters? Now, when it comes to Kantianism, many critics think that Kantianism is a little bit too rigid, because it would contend that certain things are in and of themselves wrong, no ifs and or buts. Remember that Kant contends that lying is in and of itself immoral. Why? Because it disrespects the dignity of beings that have inherent worth. And to use another phrase, it treats beings with dignity paternalistically, as if they were tiny little children who can't think for themselves and also who can't handle the truth. Remember, moral agents are deserving of respect. Lying disrespects said beings. Therefore, lying is inherently wrong, even when lying might do what? Even in cases where lying might do a greater good. Well, Kantian ethics isn't about doing the greater good. And critics might say, shouldn't doing the greater good also matter too? This is why some ethical theories that we will see have tried to take elements of both of these ethical theories in order to concoct some kind of hybrid model that tries to take account of these duties that don't seem to be picked up in utilitarianism or Kantian. In chapter 16, for example, we will see a model of an ethical theory from W.D. Ross that will contend that there are a list of duties. Some of those duties will sound mostly Kantian. Some will sound mostly utilitarian. But yeah, there will be some pluralistic models that will try to deal with some of these problems. Now, the author kind of lays this out, but I've kind of said this already. Concerns about ethical monism. How might we respond once we realize that there are issues with some of these monistic theories that we consider? We might decide to go out and search for some other monistic model. Why? Well, because I've already said why many of us have a preference for monistic models. We might decide to ditch the theories that we have, but to look for some other fundamental principle. 2, stick with our theory and find ways of modifying it to address objections. This is exactly what we will see in chapter 15 with the doctrine of double effect and the doctrine of doing and allowing. Attempts to modify the Kantian model of ethics in order to deal with problems that is unable to deal with when taken at face value. Or 3, abandon monism altogether and check out and potentially adopt some pluralistic model. Now, what is pluralism? Pluralistic theories deny that ethics can be systematized under a single rule. They assert a plurality of rules, principles, or values, and they tend to deny absolutism. Now, there are 3 different pluralistic approaches that we will discuss in upcoming lectures. The first is one that is called prima facie duties, and don't worry if that sounds fancy, Dan, right now. We'll explain it later on. But that is the pluralistic approach of W.D. Ross that we'll be looking at shortly. We will be looking at virtue ethics. Specifically, we will discuss, and this was an Aristotelian model from ancient Greece, that some classical theorists still think has merit. And then finally, we will look at a feminist approach to ethics. And in a nutshell, it will contend that an overarching value that we should consider, which is not absolute, is what is called an ethics of care. It will be called an ethics of care. So those are some pluralistic models we'll be looking at shortly. Now, in order to try to sort of deal with some of the problems associated with Kantian ethics when faced with specific cases, the author brings up the problem of torture. Now, suppose that you've got a high-value suspect that you know has some specific information. Now, according to Kant, it is, generally speaking, always immoral to do intentional harm to a center of dignity. Center of dignity for me is just fancy Dan for a rational human being. In other words, on the surface, a Kantian would have to argue that it is always wrong to do something like torture. It is always wrong to intentionally destroy another life. Now, the problem is, in real-life situations, in order to prevent catastrophes or disasters, as the author put it, sometimes these actions seem to be inevitable. Not ones that we're going to jump for joy and say yay about, but they seem like they might be necessary evils. Now, folks, in general, a utilitarian wouldn't have a problem with dealing with catastrophe prevention or disaster prevention. And this is just a little bit of review. Remember that one of the said potential advantages of utilitarianism was the author said that it is flexible. Now, what the author meant by that is this. Because the principle of utility says, always act in such a way to promote the general well-being, nothing is technically off the table as long as it prevents, or rather, as long as it promotes the general well-being. There is nothing inherently wrong with torture, according to utilitarianism. Torture would turn out to be the moral point of view if indeed carrying out that torture would end up producing good net results. And by the way, folks, it is irrelevant whether or not the person being tortured was the bad guy or not. If you had to torture a decent, innocent person in order to maximize welfare, it would still be the right thing to do. Because remember, net outcomes, net well-being, is what utilitarianism is concerned with. Now, folks, some people have a problem with that. If you happen to lean Kantian, you undoubtedly have a problem with that. Because you would say, and this is the author's phrase, that utilitarianism would sometimes lead us to have to do things that we would call highly unjust in order to promote the greater good. Torturing some innocent person doesn't seem to be just. However, many regular people don't happen to have much of a problem if they're torturing a bad guy. You get my drift here? Because they don't think it's a problem of injustice there. Because they think he or she deserved it. But yeah, in general, Kantianism wouldn't promote stuff like this. So how does Kant get around this? We don't have time to elucidate this completely today. But the solution will be, or I should say the approach will be, the doctrine of double effect. We'll have to talk about this more in the next part of our lecture, but I will be abbreviating the doctrine of double effect, the DDE, on the board for short. It saves ink, and if you've heard me, you already know what I'm talking about. Now, the doctrine of double effect does this, folks. It makes, remember, Kantianism is concerned not with the outcomes of our actions. Kantianism is concerned with the intention. Are we intending to follow the moral law? Is our motive to follow the categorical imperative? If it is, then we deserve a moral gold star, according to Kantianism, as long as you're attempting or intending to follow the moral law. Now, guess what? These disasters sometimes lead to what? Or what some people would call moral conflicts. Because to do what one would intend to do in order to follow the moral law would lead to what? Unwanted, but foreseen. but unwanted, but foreseen outcomes that are not technically what? That are not technically intended. And I guess I'll go for the easy one, since we're talking about torture, and we'll continue with this next time. The Kantian who would say it is moral in this situation to undertake torture would say, our intent is to save innocent lives. It is foreseen that in order to save those innocent lives, that a few eggs might need to be broken. However, we are not really intending torture. We are intending to save lives. Now, for utilitarian critics, the utilitarian would say, this is merely rhetorical gymnastics that basically leads to our point of view. So you're basically being utilitarians, but basically trying to lie to yourself. In other words, the utilitarian would think this looks like chicanery here. Bogus, bullcrap, rhetorical gymnastics to try to cover up the reality. Your real aim is to do the greater good. When you talk about the intent of saving innocent lives, that's really pretty much the greater good anyway. You're doing the same thing as we would, but merely trying to disguise it in Kantian garb. Now, we will continue this next time and discuss some more examples, strengths, and weaknesses of the DDE before shifting gears and talking about the doctrine of doing and allowing. Cheers.